Pokemon fans, Tamashii here, and today I've got something you've all been waiting for. Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald is requested by basically everyone. You guys really want to hear what I have to say about these games, huh? Well, it's no surprise. The first two Pokemon generations were undisputed classics. The Hoenn region is where fans really started to get divided. A status quo had already been established in the series, and the backlash from Pokemania was in full force. People seem to either really love these games or hate them, so to satisfy your curiosity, I'll give you my perspective and my view of the Advanced generation. The Gold, Silver, and Crystal versions were the first to introduce a new set of Pokemon. This was a monumental event within the Pokemon community, and we greeted it with open minds and reverence. With Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, however, it lacked that added novelty, and many people disliked the new Pokemon simply because they were unfamiliar. My first time playing Ruby, I had the same issue. At that point, I was no longer watching the anime, so I hadn't been introduced to the new Pokemon in any way, and suddenly it felt like I was out of the loop. These Pokemon were strangers. Soon though, as I caught and trained each new Pokemon, I was able to get into it and enjoy myself again. Soon I knew the names and moves of each Pokemon by heart, and they became friends just like all my Pokemon before had. As I grew more and more comfortable with the new region, it felt like home again, and I loved it every bit as much as the previous Pokemon games. A lot of kids had problems with the fact that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald weren't compatible with the Game Boy Pokemon games. You couldn't transfer data and Pokemon from your red, blue, yellow, gold, silver, or crystal cartridges like you could between Johto and Kanto with the time capsule. This was because they increased the individual values for each Pokemon from 15 to 31. If you had been able to transfer your Pokemon, they would have basically been useless and unable to compete with the newer, stronger Pokemon. Another reason for the incompatibility was because the technology of the Game Boy Advance was way different from that of the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Advance was a 32-bit system with tons of capabilities, and the original Game Boy was only 8-bit. It's like trying to use floppy disks on a Windows 7. The technology was just too different to fit. But there were of course upsides to moving to a better platform. Being the first major Pokemon game on a system other than the Game Boy, it was also incredibly beautiful. Hoenn dazzled me, and it made it easier for me to imagine the world I lived in as part of the Pokemon world too. The reflections in puddles after it rained, your footprints on the sand, the animated Pokemon sprites in Emerald revived from Pokemon Crystal, the ash floating down from the mountain as you make your way to Follower Town, and even little things like the flowers blowing in the wind made Hoenn more vivid, beautiful, and fun to explore. It managed to bring Pokemon into 32-bit territory while still keeping the classic art style we all knew and loved it for. Something I wish they had carried over from GSC though, where the light changes from day to night. I'm sure there was some reason it didn't graduate into this generation. Perhaps they weren't used to the graphical capabilities of the new system, or there just wasn't room after 386 Pokemon, but it was a bit disappointing to see the games take a step backward after so many advancements. Hoenn expanded the Pokemon universe in more ways than just landmass though. This generation was responsible for a ton of new features, like the ever-useful running shoes, the fun contests, the battle frontier, the different kinds of bikes, secret bases, double battles, and even the first ever cutscene in a Pokemon game. This time around, the villains were more than just power-hungry goofballs. They were environmental extremists, and while their intentions were good, their methods were not. Rather than just the simple good guys and bad guys, the two teams really made the player choose which stance they took on the issue, and made kids think more about bad people and why they do the things they do. Choosing a side became ambiguous, and it showed that Pokemon was growing up with its audience. Ultimately, when neither voice seemed right, it was up to the player to decide the future of the planet. There are some features, however, that I'm not so fond of. The limiting of effort values and individual values really created a rift between casual and competitive Pokemon trainers. Though there were similar mechanics in previous games, the RSC EVs and IVs were limited, meaning only people who understood the system could use them to their advantage. Whether the RSC, EV, and IV systems were intended by the programmers to be manipulated by players this way is unknown, but somebody figured out how it worked and it became a staple of competitive battling. This bothers me because as a casual gamer, it was difficult to find someone to link up and battle with just for fun. It created this elitist segment of the Pokemon fanbase that casual trainers felt left out of. It also increased the emphasis on the battling aspect of the game even more, and alienated those who were less into battling and more into collecting like myself. Whatever happened to Gotta Catch 'Em All? It wasn't even on the front cover anymore. In spite of this though, the Advanced generation did nothing but improve the Pokemon franchise. Its unpopularity can only be attributed to bad timing and the effects of the backlash from Pokemania. Pokemon's fanbase was starting to evaporate at this point, and it left behind only die-hard fans and newcomers in its wake. Those of us who stuck with it and looked at it with open minds enjoyed it so much we were willing to face the ridicule of our peers, who by that point saw Pokemon as taboo and wildly uncool. Some fans blamed the games themselves for this rift, but really it was just the inevitable rejection each fan faces from its fanbase as they grow older and leave things behind for fear of looking childish. So even though my opinion might not be the popular one, I really liked Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. After all, if it weren't for them, I would never have joined YouTube or met a lot of the people who are in my life right now. I owe RSD a lot, and I owe you, my viewers, a lot too. So thank you for watching, and stick around for more Pokemon videos.